Mr. Sterling, the Tokyo call is in 5 minutes. His assistant's voice filtered through the intercom, crisp and efficient. Alexander didn't turn. His fingers traced the edge of a silver-framed photograph on his desk. Isabella laughing on their honeymoon in Santorini, her eyes crinkling at the corners, sunlight catching the gold in her hair. 10 years of marriage built on carefully curated truths. He'd told her about his humble beginnings, his father's bankruptcy, his relentless climb from nothing. He'd omitted Clara. He'd omitted the 2 small lives growing in a quiet suburban house 200 miles away. His phone vibrated, a discreet, encrypted device kept separate from his primary line. The screen displayed a single word: Clara. His throat tightened. Every vibration from that phone was a tremor in the foundation of his carefully constructed world. "Reschedule Tokyo," he said into the intercom, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I'll join remotely." He waited until the office door clicked shut before answering. "Clara." "Alexander." Her voice carried the soft lilt of their shared hometown, a melody that still unraveled him after all these years. "Liam has a recital tonight. He asked if you'd come." The air left his lungs in a slow exhale. Liam, his son, 5 years old with Alexander's stubborn chin and Clara's curious eyes. And Maya, his twin sister, who'd drawn him a picture last week of Daddy with big buildings. They called him Daddy on video calls, though he'd never tucked them into bed, never wiped tears from scraped knees, never smelled their hair after bath time. "I can't tonight," he said, the words ash in his mouth. The quarterly board meeting. The board meeting was yesterday, Clara interrupted, not with anger but with a quiet resignation that cut deeper than shouting ever could. "You promised last month. And the month before." "I'm trying, Clara. You know I am." A pause stretched between them, filled with the ghosts of what might have been, a life where he'd stayed in that rain-soaked apartment, where he'd chosen love over legacy. Maya asked why other daddies come to school events. I didn't know what to tell her. The words landed like stones in his chest. He stared at Isabella's photograph, at the woman who believed she knew every contour of his soul. She'd never seen him flinch at a child's laughter in a restaurant. She didn't know about the panic that seized him when colleagues mentioned weekend soccer games with their kids. She thought his late nights were about mergers and acquisitions. She didn't know he sometimes drove to the edge of Clara's neighborhood just to watch the warm yellow light spill from their kitchen window, a spectator in his own children's lives. "I'll make it next week," he whispered, the promise feeling hollow even as he spoke it. "I'll transfer additional funds today. Whatever they need, it's not about the money, Alexander." Her voice broke just once. It never was. The line went dead. He lowered the phone, his reflection staring back from the black screen. A man in an expensive suit surrounded by symbols of success, utterly alone in a room full of light. He opened a hidden folder on his encrypted laptop, fingers moving on autopilot. Bank transfers scheduled with military precision, $15,000 monthly to Clara's account, $50,000 to a trust fund bearing the twins' names, payments to the discreet private school he'd chosen for them. He'd built them a gilded cage with his silence, believing distance would protect everyone. Isabella from scandal, his children from the messy truth of his divided heart, himself from the terrifying vulnerability of being truly known. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Isabella stood in the doorway, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. The way he liked it, 1 sugar, no cream. She wore a simple linen dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. No trace of the corporate armor she donned for charity galas. In that moment, she looked exactly as she had the night they met at a bookstore, arguing passionately about poetry until closing time. "You've been quiet all morning," she said, placing his mug beside the photograph. Her fingers brushed his shoulder, warm and sure. Everything all right? The question hung between them, simple and devastating. He could tell her. Right now. He could say the words that would shatter their world, but might, just might, rebuild something more honest from the pieces. He looked into her eyes, hazel flecked with gold, trusting completely, and felt the walls of his secret press in tighter. "Just Tokyo," he said, forcing a smile that felt like a betrayal. "Market volatility." She studied him for a heartbeat too long, and in that suspended moment, Alexander felt the first crack in his fortress. But then she smiled, that radiant, forgiving smile that had carried him through boardroom battles and personal crises alike. "You carry the weight of the world on your shoulders," she murmured, kissing his temple. "Remember to let me help you carry it sometimes." When she left, closing the door softly behind her, Alexander stared at the coffee she'd brought him. Steam curled upward like a ghost. He thought of Liam's recital tonight, the small boy in a too-big suit, scanning the audience for a face that wouldn't be there. He thought of Maya's drawing tucked in his wallet, crayon lines forming a stick-figure family that included a tall man with a briefcase. And he thought of Isabella's hand on his shoulder, her faith in him as solid as bedrock. The phone vibrated again. A text from Clara: "Don't bother coming next week. We'll manage without you." Alexander closed his eyes. The city glittered beyond the glass, a kingdom he'd built with his own hands. But in the silence of his office, surrounded by everything money could buy, he finally understood the terrible truth he'd been running from. He wasn't hiding his secret family to protect his marriage. He was hiding it because he couldn't bear to face the man he'd become. The man who chose boardrooms over bedtime stories, who measured love in wire transfers instead of presents. And as the first tear traced a path down his cheek, unseen, unacknowledged, he knew with chilling certainty that secrets don't stay buried forever. They wait. They grow. And when they finally surface, they don't just reveal the truth, they remake it entirely. The real question wasn't whether Isabella would discover his double life. It was whether any of them would recognize themselves. She arranged fresh peonies in a crystal vase, their fragrance soft and persistent, like the love she believed anchored her marriage. At 38, she carried herself with a calm certainty that came from building a life beside a man she thought she knew completely. 10 years of shared sunrises, whispered secrets in the dark, weathering his business crises with steady hands and unwavering faith. She'd stood by him when his first company nearly collapsed, had sold her grandmother's pearls to cover payroll without him ever knowing. That was the foundation they'd built, trust as tangible as the rings on their fingers. But this morning, something had shifted. Not dramatically, a flicker really. The way Alexander had avoided her gaze over breakfast, his knuckles white around his coffee cup when she mentioned attending the children's hospital fundraiser together next week. He'd murmured agreement while staring at his phone screen as if it held answers to questions she hadn't yet learned to ask. "Alexander," she'd said gently, reaching across the table. Her fingers had brushed his wrist. He'd flinched, just slightly, but enough. Enough for her to notice. Now, alone in the silent apartment, she stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city he'd conquered. Her reflection stared back, a woman in a cream-colored sweater, hair pulled into a loose knot, eyes holding a quiet intelligence that had earned her respect in boardrooms long before she'd married into wealth. She'd put her own career on hold after their wedding, not because he'd asked, but because she'd wanted to build a home, a sanctuary where he could shed the armor of CEO and simply be Alexander. Lately, though, that sanctuary felt less like a refuge and more like a beautifully furnished waiting room. Her phone chimed, a message from her oldest friend, Elena. "Still on for lunch? You've been quiet lately. Everything okay with you?" And Isabella typed a reply with careful fingers. "All good. Just tired. See you at 1. She almost added he's been distant, but deleted the words. Disloyal. Unfair. Maybe he was just stressed about the European expansion. She'd seen the news. Sterling Group's stock had dipped slightly last quarter. Of course he was preoccupied. She was being paranoid, letting her imagination paint shadows where there was only ordinary strain. Yet as she walked toward his study to return a book he'd left on the nightstand, her foot caught on the edge of the Persian rug. The book tumbled from her hands, its pages fanning open across the floor. And there, half hidden beneath the desk where Alexander kept his briefcase, was a small white envelope. Her breath hitched. Not because it looked suspicious. It didn't. Just an ordinary business envelope with a bank logo in the corner. But Alexander was meticulous. Papers didn't fall in their home. Everything had its place, its system. She bent to retrieve it, intending to slide it back into his briefcase without a second thought. But the flap wasn't fully sealed, and the receipt visible inside showed a wire transfer of $15,000 to an account number she didn't recognize. The date was yesterday. The memo line read simply monthly support. A cold thread wove through her chest. Monthly support for what their household staff was paid through the estate manager. Their charitable donations went through the foundation's official channels. This was separate, personal. Isabella, she straightened quickly, heart hammering, as Alexander appeared in the doorway. He wore his navy suit now, tie perfectly knotted, the man who commanded rooms with his presence. But his eyes, when they landed on the envelope in her hand, widened almost imperceptibly. "I found this under your desk," she said, holding it out. Her voice remained steady, a testament to years of practice in diplomatic composure. "Must have slipped from your briefcase." He crossed the room in 3 strides, taking the envelope with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ah, administrative paperwork. Boring stuff. He tucked it into his inner jacket pocket with practiced ease. You know how finance departments are, always misplacing things. But she'd seen it. The fractional pause before he spoke. The way his thumb had pressed against the envelope as if to erase its existence. Monthly support, she asked softly. For the new interns, or, it's nothing for you to worry about, my love. He cupped her face, his palm warm against her cheek. The gesture was tender, familiar. Yet today it felt like a curtain drawn between them. Just business logistics. You have that lunch with Elena today. Don't let my boring spreadsheets ruin your afternoon. He kissed her forehead, a benediction, a dismissal, and strode toward the elevator bank. The doors whispered shut behind him. Isabella stood motionless in the center of the study, the scent of his cologne lingering in the air. She walked to his desk, her fingers tracing the smooth surface where he'd placed his laptop each morning for a decade. Her reflection stared back from the dark screen. A woman who had built her life on a single, unshakable belief that Alexander Sterling loved her with a completeness that left no room for secrets. But love doesn't flinch when touched. Love doesn't hide envelopes. Love doesn't look at its partner with eyes that hold entire continents of unspoken truth. She sank into his leather chair, the leather sighing beneath her weight. On the desk calendar, she noticed something she'd never paid attention to before: every 3rd Thursday. A small notation in his precise handwriting. Out of office. Personal. Always Thursdays. Always the same day of the month. Coincidence, probably. She was reading too much into nothing. 10 years of marriage couldn't be undone by a misplaced envelope and a scheduling quirk. Yet as she rose to leave the study, her gaze fell upon the family photo album left open on the side table. A relic from happier times they'd been meaning to digitize. There, on page 42, was a picture from their 5th anniversary trip to Tuscany. Alexander laughing, arm around her waist, sunlight gilding his hair. And tucked partially behind that photo, almost hidden, was the corner of another image she didn't recognize. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the Tuscan photograph. Beneath it lay a smaller print, slightly faded at the edges. A little boy with Alexander's determined chin sat on a swing, mid-laugh, arms outstretched toward the sky. And beside him, a little girl with dark curls reaching for his hand. Twins. 5 or 6 years old. Behind them, a modest suburban backyard with a plastic slide and a tire swing. No date. No names. Just 2 children who shared Alexander's eyes staring back at her from a life she'd never been invited to share. The album slipped from her hands, hitting the floor with a soft thud that echoed through the silent penthouse like a gunshot. Isabella didn't cry. Not yet. First came the ice. The slow, crystalline certainty that her world had just fractured along a fault line she never knew existed. She sank to her knees beside the fallen album, her palm pressed flat against the cool marble floor as if to steady herself against the tilting earth. The children's faces swam before her eyes, their joy so genuine, so unguarded. How long had they existed in the margins of her marriage? How many Thursday afternoons had Alexander spent in that backyard while she waited for him at charity galas? Believing his delays were due to traffic or last-minute calls, a sound escaped her throat. Half gasp, half sob, but she swallowed it down. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford yet. First, understanding. Then, whatever came after. She carefully replaced the photograph beneath the Tuscan memory, her movements precise, reverent almost. As if handling evidence at a crime scene where the victim was her own heart. When the elevator chimed its return 20 minutes later, Alexander forgetting his tablet, she was standing by the window again, peonies arranged perfectly, face composed into something resembling calm. "Forgot this," he said, retrieving the device from the charging station. He paused, studying her. "You're pale. Are you feeling all right?" She turned, offering a smile that felt carved from glass. "Just tired. Elena's been worrying me with talk of her daughter's college applications. Makes me think about paths not taken." The lie slipped out effortlessly. A shield. A weapon. She watched his face for recognition, for guilt, for any flicker of awareness that she now stood on the precipice of his secret world. He only nodded, relief softening his features. "You should take the afternoon off. Get a massage. You deserve it." As the elevator doors closed again, Isabella let the smile dissolve. She walked to the study once more, this time pulling open the bottom drawer of Alexander's desk, the one he always kept locked. Today, in his haste, he'd forgotten to turn the key. Inside, beneath financial reports and property deeds, lay a small velvet box. Not jewelry. When she lifted the lid, she found 2 tiny silver bracelets, engraved with names Liam and Maya, and a folded ultrasound image, dated 6 years ago. The date of their 5th wedding anniversary. Isabella closed the box slowly, her vision blurring not with tears but with a terrifying clarity. The man she loved had built 2 lives with the same hands that held hers each night. And as she stood there in the gilded silence of their home, she understood with chilling certainty that some secrets don't just hide the truth. They replace it entirely. The question wasn't whether she could forgive him. Warm teak decking. Their Malibu estate, Alexander's sanctuary, he called it, was a masterpiece of glass and steel cantilevered over the ocean. A place where sunset painted the walls in liquid gold and silence felt like a luxury. For 10 years, she'd believed this was their shared dream made manifest. Tonight, the view felt like a beautifully staged prison. Inside, crystal glasses clinked as staff prepared dinner. Alexander had insisted on a quiet evening. Just us, he'd said that morning, kissing her temple before his driver arrived. But Isabella had seen the hesitation in his eyes when she mentioned her sister's birthday dinner tomorrow. "I'll try to make it," he'd murmured, already scrolling through emails on his phone. Quarter-end reports are brutal this month. Now he stepped onto the terrace, loosening his tie. The setting sun haloed his silhouette, and for a heartbeat, she saw the man she'd fallen for. The one who'd recited Neruda to her on their 3rd date, who'd held her hand through her father's funeral without saying a word, whose presence had always felt like coming home. "God, it's beautiful out here," he said, wrapping arms around her from behind. His chin rested on her crown, his breath warm against her hair. "Reminds me of Santorini. Remember how we got lost in those white alleys for hours?" She stiffened almost imperceptibly. Santorini. Their honeymoon. The same week Clara had discovered she was pregnant with twins. The ultrasound image burned behind her eyelids. "I remember," she said softly, turning in his embrace. She studied his face, the strong jaw she'd traced with her fingers 1,000 nights, the laugh lines she'd once found endearing. Now she wondered which moments had been real and which had been performances. "You were so present then. No phone. No emails. Just us." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I was younger. Less responsible." He kissed her forehead, but his eyes darted toward the horizon, avoiding hers. "Sometimes I miss that version of myself." "Do you miss the version who stayed with Clara?" The question coiled in her throat like smoke. Instead, she traced the buttons of his shirt. "You've been working late lately. Even for you. European markets open while we sleep." He pulled away gently, walking to the railing. "The acquisition needs careful handling. One misstep and 5,000 employees lose their jobs." His voice carried the weight of genuine burden, the burden she'd always admired. Now she wondered if it was also a shield. Dinner arrived, seared scallops, heirloom tomatoes, a crisp Sancerre she'd selected herself. They ate on the terrace as dusk bled into violet. For 20 minutes, they spoke of safe things: Elena's daughter's college acceptance, the new wing at the children's hospital, the stubborn bougainvillea refusing to bloom by the pool. Normalcy draped over them like a fine linen tablecloth, but Isabella felt the tension humming beneath. 2 people performing a script they'd written together, now aware that entire acts had been rewritten without her knowledge. Then Alexander's phone buzzed. Not the primary device beside his plate, the discreet encrypted one he kept in his jacket pocket. He excused himself with a murmured business emergency, stepping inside to take the call. Isabella didn't follow. She simply watched through the glass wall as he paced the living room, his posture shifting from corporate authority to something softer, more vulnerable. She saw him run a hand through his hair, the gesture he made when frustrated or moved. She saw his shoulders slump slightly, and when he turned toward the window, his face illuminated by the screen's glow, she saw tears glistening in his eyes. "He's crying for them," she realized with a jolt that stole her breath. "Not for me. Never for me like this." When he returned, his composure was restored, but his eyes held a rawness that couldn't be concealed. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Just Tokyo markets reacting to news." He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing we can't handle." She nodded, lifting her wineglass. The liquid trembled slightly. She began, choosing her words with surgical precision. "My sister asked about godparents for her new baby. Made me think. We never really discussed having children of our own." The silence that followed was heavier than any ocean wave. Alexander's fork clattered against his plate. We talked about this, Isabella, he said quietly. Your career. The travel. You said you weren't sure you wanted that kind of responsibility. You said I wasn't sure. The subtle shift in language, making her uncertainty his justification, sent ice through her veins. She remembered that conversation vividly. She'd been 29, considering an MBA program in London. She'd said, I want to explore my options before settling down. He'd replied, of course. No pressure. What she hadn't known was that Clara was already 6 months pregnant with his twins. I was young, she said now, holding his gaze. People change. Dreams evolve. Don't you ever wonder what it would be like to come home to small shoes by the door? To read bedtime stories? To have someone call you daddy? His face went utterly still. For 3 heartbeats, he simply stared at her, his knuckles white around his wineglass. The ocean roared below them, a vast and different witness. I think about it every day, he whispered. The raw honesty in his voice shattered her. This wasn't deflection or evasion. It was a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the man drowning in his own choices. And in that moment, she understood the terrible geometry of his life. He loved her. He loved Clara. He loved the children he kept at a distance. And he was destroying all of them, trying to hold these fractured pieces together. Then why, she began, her voice breaking. But he stood abruptly, chair scraping against teak. I need air. He walked to the edge of the terrace, shoulders hunched against a wind that carried the salt taste of truth. Isabella remained seated, watching the stars emerge one by one, a slow unveiling of light in the darkness. She thought of Liam and Maya in their modest backyard, waiting for a father who measured. Love and wire transfers. She thought of Clara, raising twins alone while Alexander built empires. And she thought of herself, 10 years of marriage built on a foundation of omission. When he returned to the table, his eyes were dry but haunted. I'm sorry, he said, the words simple and devastating. For tonight. For everything I haven't said. She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. His skin was cold. You don't have to carry everything alone, Alexander. Not with me. He turned his hand, lacing his fingers through hers. A gesture of intimacy that now felt like crossing a border into occupied territory. What if what I'm carrying would break you? Try me. The words hung between them, an invitation and a threat. For a long moment, she thought he might speak, might finally unravel the secret that had grown between them like a vine choking a tree. She saw the struggle in his eyes, the desire for absolution warring with the terror of exposure. Then his phone buzzed again. This time he didn't check it. He simply stared at the dark screen as if it held a verdict. Tomorrow, he said finally, his voice thick. Let's talk tomorrow. Properly. But as they retired to their bedroom, their king-sized bed with its 1,000 thread-count sheets, the room where they'd made love and dreamed and built a life together, Isabella knew tomorrow would bring only more deflection. She watched him undress in the ensuite bathroom, his reflection fragmented in the beveled mirror. Each shard showed a different angle of the same man, the husband, the provider, the ghost father, the liar. When he slid beneath the covers beside her, he reached for her as always, his arms settling around her waist. But tonight, his touch felt like evidence being collected. She lay perfectly still, breathing evenly until his own breaths deepened into sleep. Only then did she slip from the bed, padding silently to the terrace where the ocean breathed its ancient rhythm. From her pocket, she withdrew the ultrasound image she'd secretly photographed earlier. The grainy black and white proof of a life created while she'd been planning their 5th anniversary trip. She held it against her chest, the paper thin as a secret, fragile as trust. Who are you really? She whispered to the night, to the man sleeping inside, to the children whose faces she now knew by heart. And who do I become when I stop pretending I don't know? The first stars of morning glimmered on the horizon. Somewhere, Clara was waking her twins for school. Somewhere, Alexander's secret life was beginning its daily rhythm. Breakfasts without him, school runs without him, bedtime stories read by a mother doing double duty. And here, in this gilded cage overlooking the Pacific, Isabella Sterling made a quiet decision that would alter every life it touched. She would no longer be the woman who waited for explanations. She would become the architect of her own truth. The wind carried the scent of jasmine from the garden below, a sweet, persistent fragrance pushing through cracks in the stone. Like secrets, like resolve, like the first green shoots of a life about to be remade from the ground up. And as dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, she understood that some discovery's daddy had carved a hollow space beneath his ribs that no amount of wealth could fill. He'd watched her sleeping form for hours, memorizing the curve of her shoulder, the way her lashes fanned against her cheeks, terrified that tomorrow's promised conversation would be the unraveling of everything. But first, the ritual. In his private study, the one with biometric locks and soundproofing he'd justified as corporate security, he powered on his encrypted laptop. The screen glowed in the pre-dawn darkness, casting sharp shadows across his face. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency a series of passwords, a virtual private network routing through 3 countries, and finally the interface of a private banking portal most people didn't know existed. $15,000, the exact amount from the envelope Isabella had found. He initiated the transfer to Clara's account in Vermont, adding an extra $5,000 this month. Guilt money, he called it privately. For piano lessons Liam had mentioned during their last call. For the orthodontist consultation Maya would need soon. For the quiet dignity of a mother raising his children without the daily presence of their father. As the confirmation screen appeared, transfer completed, his secondary phone vibrated. Clara's contact photo filled the screen, not her face, but a snapshot of the twins building a sandcastle last summer, their small hands working in perfect unison. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Good morning, Alexander." Her voice was soft with morning grogginess, but beneath it lay the careful neutrality she'd perfected over 5 years. "They're awake. Been asking for you since 6. A pause. Then the shuffling sound of small feet, a giggle, and suddenly 2 faces filled the screen. Liam's earnest brown eyes, Maya's gap-toothed smile missing her front teeth. "Daddy," they chorused, their voices overlapping in that twin harmony that never failed to crack his composure. "Good morning, my loves," he said, his voice thickening despite his efforts. He angled the laptop so they could see his face clearly, the face they knew only through glass and light. "Did you sleep well?" Liam nodded seriously, pushing glasses up his nose. "I dreamed about dinosaurs. Real ones, not cartoon ones. I dreamed you came to my school play," Maya added quietly, twisting the hem of her pajama top. "You sat in the front row and clapped the loudest." The words landed like stones in his chest. He'd missed 3 school events this year. For birthdays, countless bedtime stories. He forced a smile, the kind he used in shareholder meetings to convey confidence he didn't feel. "I'll be there for the next one, sweetheart. I promise." Clara's hand entered the frame, gently smoothing Maya's hair. "We should let Daddy get to work," she murmured, but her eyes, just visible at the edge of the screen, held a quiet challenge. "You promised last time too." "Wait." Liam scrambled closer to the camera. "Look what I made." He held up a construction paper rocket ship, clumsily glued together, a crayon drawing of a man in a suit taped to the cockpit. "That's you flying to space to save the galaxy." Alexander's vision blurred. He blinked rapidly, turning his face slightly as if adjusting his position. "It's magnificent, Liam. The best rocket I've ever seen. Will you hang it in your office?" Maya asked, her voice small. "So you remember us when you're working?" The question undid him completely. He had to swallow twice before answering. "I'll hang it right next to my desk. Everyone who visits will see it." Clara gently took the phone. "Time for breakfast, you two. Say goodbye to Daddy." "Bye, Daddy," they chimed, waving with small hands before disappearing from the frame. The screen showed only Clara now, her expression unreadable. "They asked why you never come on weekends anymore." "I've been, Alexander." Her voice was gentle but firm. "They're 5 years old. They don't understand corporate acquisitions. They understand presence. Or absence." He ran a hand over his face, the exhaustion of a decade of compartmentalization pressing down on him. "I'm trying to build something stable for them. A future. A future without you in it." She didn't say it cruelly. Just stated it as fact, the truth they'd both been avoiding. Money doesn't tuck them in at night. Money doesn't explain why other kids have dads at soccer practice. They don't need another transfer, Alexander. They need their father. The words hung between them, heavy and true. He thought of Isabella waiting in their bedroom, of the conversation promised for today, of the life he'd built on foundations of sand. 2 families. 2 sets of love. One man stretched so thin he was becoming transparent. "I'll come this weekend," he said, the words escaping before he could calculate the logistics, the lies required. "I'll cancel the London trip. I'll be there Saturday morning." Clara studied him through the pixelated screen, her gaze piercing the distance between them. "Don't make promises you'll break again. It hurts them more than your absence ever could." "I know." His voice broke on the words. "God, Clara, I know." When the call ended, Silence rushed in like floodwater. He sat motionless in the leather chair. The ghost images of his children burned onto his retinas. On his main desk phone, a reminder flashed 9 a.m., board strategy session, European acquisition. The life he'd built. The empire he'd sacrificed everything for. But all he could see was Maya's hopeful face asking if he'd hang her drawing in his office. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he'd never hung a single one of their artworks on his walls. Not because he didn't love them, but because to display their drawings in his world would be to acknowledge the fracture running through his soul, and he'd spent 5 years pretending the crack didn't exist. He opened a hidden drawer and withdrew a small wooden box. Inside lay treasures he'd collected in secret. Liam's first lost tooth in a tiny velvet pouch, Maya's finger-painted Mother's Day card mistakenly addressed to Daddy, a lock of hair from their first haircut. He'd never shown these to Isabella, had never spoken their names aloud in their home. He'd built a museum of absence right here in the heart of his success. A soft knock at the study door made him startle, hastily closing the box. Isabella stood there, dressed in cream linen, hair damp from the shower, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You're up early," she said, her voice carrying none of the tension he expected. She placed his mug on the desk, exactly how he liked it. "I thought we could watch the sunrise together before your day begins." He stared at her, searching for cracks in her composure, for signs she'd discovered his secret. But her eyes held only the familiar warmth he'd built his life upon. Relief washed through him, so potent it felt like pain. "Thank you," he managed, his voice rough. He took the coffee, his fingers brushing hers. A simple touch that now felt charged with unspoken history. She lingered by the window, watching the sun ignite the ocean's surface. "I was thinking last night," she began softly. "About what you said. About carrying things alone." She turned to face him, her expression open, vulnerable. "Whatever it is, Alexander, you don't have to hide it from me. Not ever." The words were an invitation. A lifeline. He opened his mouth to speak, to finally unravel the truth coiled tight in his chest for 5 years. But his encrypted phone buzzed again. A text from Clara. Maya woke up crying. Said she dreamed you forgot her name. The message landed like a verdict. He looked from the phone to Isabella's trusting face, caught between 2 worlds, 2 loves, 2 versions of himself. And in that suspended moment, he made his choice, not with words, but with silence. He slid the phone face down on the desk. "Let's talk after my board meeting," he said, the words ash in his mouth. "I want to give you my full attention." Isabella studied him for a long moment, her gaze lingering on the encrypted phone now hidden from view. Then she smiled, a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. Always the businessman first." She left the study, closing the door softly behind her. Alexander sat alone in the gathering light, the coffee growing cold between his hands. He'd chosen silence again, chosen the lie that felt safer than the truth. But as he stared at the closed door, he felt the first tremor of consequence. Not from Clara, not from the children, but from the woman who had just offered him grace and been met with evasion. Some secrets, he was beginning to understand, don't just hide the truth. They poison the ground where love tries to grow. And as the sun climbed higher, painting his empire in gold, Alexander Sterling felt the foundations of his carefully precise, automatic. But beneath the surface calm, a storm was gathering, slow, deep, inevitable. His evasion in the study hadn't been casual. It had been deliberate. A door closing where she'd offered an open hand. She busied herself arranging wildflowers in a ceramic vase, her fingers trembling slightly as she snapped stems. Normalcy was a performance she'd mastered over 10 years of marriage, but today the script felt foreign on her tongue. When the housekeeper arrived with groceries, Isabella forced a smile, discussing menu plans for the week, as if her world hadn't fractured at the seams hours earlier. It was during this charade that she remembered the charity gala invitations waiting on Alexander's desk, elegant cream cards requiring his signature before noon. An errand, a purpose, anything to escape the suffocating silence of the penthouse. She found his study exactly as he'd left it, the encrypted phone face down on the desk, the laptop screen dark, the leather chair still indented with the ghost of his weight. She moved quickly, not wanting to be caught here again, her fingers brushing the stack of envelopes beside the blotter. And there it was, the same bank envelope she'd found days ago, but this time slightly open, a corner of paper protruding like a whispered secret. Her breath caught. She told herself to leave it, to walk away, to trust the man who had held her through miscarriages she'd never told him about, who had memorized her coffee order before their first anniversary, whose hand still found hers in movie theaters after all these years. But her fingers betrayed her resolve. She lifted the envelope gently, as if handling something fragile. Inside lay not just one receipt, but 3 monthly wire transfers spanning the past quarter, each for $15,000, each bearing the same account number she'd memorized from her first discovery. But beneath them, something new, a notarized document titled Minor Trust Agreement. Liam and Maya Sterling, dated 6 years ago. Her wedding anniversary. The date burned behind her eyes. And then she saw it, a handwritten note tucked beneath the legal pages, Alexander's familiar script looping across hotel stationery from a conference in Boston last month. Clara. Attached the school tuition payment. Tell Liam I saw the rocket drawing. It's on my desk. Tell Maya I'll never forget her name. I'm trying. The words blurred as tears welled, hot and sudden. Liam. Maya. Names she'd only seen on silver bracelets hidden in a locked drawer. Names that belonged to children who called her husband Daddy. A soft chime echoed through the penthouse. Alexander's car returning early from his board meeting. Panic seized her. She shoved the documents back into the envelope, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. But in her haste, a single receipt fluttered to the floor, landing face down near the desk leg. She couldn't retrieve it now. Footsteps approached the study door. Isabella straightened, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, forcing her expression into neutral calm just as Alexander entered. He wore his charcoal overcoat, the scent of rain and city air clinging to him. Board meeting ended early, he said, loosening his scarf. His gaze swept the room, lingering for a fraction of a second too long on the desk. Everything all right, fine, she said, her voice miraculously steady. She gestured to the invitation cards. Just needed your signature for the Children's Hospital Gala. He nodded, crossing to the desk. And there, his eyes dropped to the floor, to the receipt lying face down like a fallen leaf. For 3 heartbeats, he simply stared at it. Isabella watched his face transform recognition, calculation, dread, all flickering behind his eyes before he schooled his features into practiced neutrality. He bent slowly, retrieving the paper. His fingers trembled as he turned it over. When he saw the bank logo, the amount, the account number, his entire body went rigid. Isabella, he began, his voice low. But she held up a hand, her palm trembling slightly. Don't. I can explain. Can you? The words escaped before she could cage them. Can you explain why there's a trust fund for children named Liam and Maya Children, who apparently have a father who sends them drawings and promises he never keeps the color drained from his face? He hadn't expected her to know the names. The specificity of her question landed like a physical blow. Where did you? I found the bracelets, she whispered, the confession tearing from her throat. The ultrasound. The photograph of them on the swing. I've known for days, Alexander. I've been waiting for you to tell me. Silence stretched between them, thick as fog. Outside, a seagull cried. Against the vast Pacific. Inside, the life they'd built together began to dissolve molecule by molecule. I was going to tell you, he said finally, his voice raw. After the acquisition closes. I didn't want to destabilize everything. Destabilize what her voice rose, cracking with a pain so profound it felt like breaking. Our marriage, or your carefully managed double life, did you think I wouldn't notice you flinching when I touched you, that I wouldn't see the guilt in your eyes every time I mentioned wanting children of our own? He reached for her. But she stepped back, her heel catching the edge of the Persian rug. She stumbled, catching herself against the bookshelf, her hand knocking against the family album. It tumbled open to page 42, the Tuscany photograph now displaced, revealing the hidden image of the twins in full view. Alexander stared at the photograph as if seeing it for the first time in their home. His face crumpled. They're 5 years old, he whispered. Twins. Clara and I. It was before we met. A brief relationship I thought had ended. Then she called when I was preparing for our wedding. Said she was pregnant. I panicked. I thought I could provide for them without this. He gestured between them, between the photograph and their life. I thought money would be enough. Money, Isabella repeated, the word tasting like ash. You thought $15,000 a month would replace a father at bedtime, that wire transfers could substitute for scraped knees and school plays, and I love yous whispered in the dark. Tears streamed down her face now, unchecked. Do you have any idea what it's like to realize the man you've loved for 10 years has been living an entire parallel existence, that every anniversary dinner, every vacation, every time you held me after a nightmare, You were carrying this secret like a second heartbeat. I love you, he said, the words desperate, pleading. I've always loved you. Clara was a chapter one thought I'd closed. But when the twins came, they're not a chapter, Alexander. She cried, her voice breaking. They're children. With names. With drawings they want you to hang in your office. While I've been here, waiting for you to want children with me, you've been someone's father all along. She sank into the leather chair he'd occupied hours earlier, the leather sighing beneath her weight. The view beyond the glass, the ocean, the sky, the endless horizon, suddenly felt like the edge of a world she no longer recognized. Look at me, she whispered. He knelt before her, taking her hands. His were cold. Hers were ice. Tell me the truth, she said, her gaze locking with his. Every detail. No more hiding. No more monthly support euphemisms. Who are they? Where do they live? How often do you see them? And most importantly, her voice fractured. When you made love to me on our wedding night, did you think of her? Did you think of them? The questions hung in the air, each one a scalpel cutting deeper than the last. Alexander bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The mighty Alexander Sterling, billionaire, titan of industry, master of boardrooms, reduced to a man on his knees before the wreckage of his own choices. I see them once a month, he admitted, the words barely audible. In Vermont, a small house with a tire swing in the backyard. Clara works as a librarian. She never asked for anything beyond child support. She's remarkable. And the children, his voice broke completely. They're everything good I've ever done, Isabella. And I've failed them every single day. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, stripped bare of all pretense. I didn't think of Clara on our wedding night. I thought only of you. I've loved you exclusively since the moment I met you in that bookstore. But loving you didn't erase my responsibility to them. And my cowardice in hiding them has poisoned everything, including us. Isabella stared at him, seeing not the liar, not the secret keeper, but the terrified man beneath. The boy from nothing who'd built an empire but couldn't build the courage to live one honest life. And in that moment, she understood the terrible truth: his betrayal wasn't born of malice, but of a fear so profound it had calcified into a second life. He hadn't chosen Clara over her. He'd chosen silence over vulnerability. And in doing so, he'd orphaned his own children while building a gilded cage for his wife. She withdrew her hands slowly, standing to face the ocean once more. The tide was turning, waves crashing against the cliffs with renewed force. I need to go, she said softly. I need to breathe air that doesn't smell like secrets. Please don't leave, he begged, rising to follow her. Let me fix this. Let me bring them into our lives properly. We can know. She turned, her eyes holding a sorrow deeper than anger. You don't get to decide how this unfolds anymore. 4 or 5 years, you've controlled the narrative. What I knew when I knew it, how much truth I deserved. That ends now. She walked toward the bedroom to pack a bag, her steps measured, deliberate. At the doorway, she paused without turning back. That receipt on the floor, she said quietly. I saw it before you did. I left it there to see what you'd do. To see if you'd finally choose honesty over concealment. She finally looked at him over her shoulder, her face a mask of heartbreak and resolve. You picked it up and hid it again. That was your last chance, Alexander. And you failed. As she disappeared down the hall, Alexander stood alone in the study, the ocean roaring beyond the glass, the photograph of his hidden children staring up from the floor. And for the first time in his meticulously controlled life, he understood that some fractures cannot be repaired with money, with promises, or with love alone. Some truths, once uncovered, demand not forgiveness, but transformation. And as the front door clicked shut behind Isabella, he knew with still lying on the floor between them and the vast, indifferent ocean. For 10 seconds, he simply breathed, waiting for the sound of her key turning in the lock again, for the soft footsteps returning to explain this was just anger, just a momentary rupture that love could heal. But the silence deepened. He stumbled to the window, just in time to see her emerge from the private elevator onto the driveway below. She carried only a small leather overnight bag, no frantic packing, no dramatic exit with suitcases. Just a woman walking away from a decade of marriage with the quiet dignity of someone who had already left long before her body followed. Isabella, he called, his voice cracking against the glass. She didn't turn, didn't pause, just slid into the back of a waiting town car. Elena's car, he realized with a fresh stab of pain, and disappeared down the winding coastal road. The penthouse, once a sanctuary of curated beauty, now felt like a museum of absence. He sank to his knees beside the fallen photograph, his fingers tracing the faces of Liam and Maya on the swing. Their joy mocked him. How many times had he promised to visit? How many school plays had he missed while negotiating deals that now felt meaningless? He'd built an empire to prove he was worthy of love, only to discover he'd been too afraid to live honestly within it. His phone buzzed on the desk, Clara's name flashing on the encrypted screen. He almost didn't answer. Almost let the call go to voicemail where all his cowardice belonged. But a deeper instinct pulled him, the raw, unvarnished truth he'd avoided for 5 years. Alexander. Clara's voice was cautious. You usually call after your board meeting. He couldn't speak at first. The words lodged in his throat like stones. Alexander, are you all right? I told her, he whispered, the confession tearing from him. Isabella knows everything. A long silence stretched across the miles between them. He heard the faint sound of children's laughter in the background. Liam and Maya playing in their backyard, oblivious to the earthquake reshaping their father's world. Oh, Alexander, Clara breathed, not with triumph or anger, but with a sorrow so profound it undid him completely. What did she say? She left. The words were ash in his mouth. She walked out and didn't look back. Another pause. Then, softly, she has every right to. You're not angry? The question surprised even him. Why would I be angry at her? Clara's voice gentled. I've spent 5 years watching you compartmentalize our children like inconvenient secrets. She just discovered she married a ghost. Her words landed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. He'd expected blame, recrimination, the messy drama of betrayed women. Instead, Clara offered clarity, the very thing he'd starved everyone of. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted, his forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window. I've spent my entire life building walls. I don't know how to tear them down without everything collapsing. Then let it collapse, Clara said simply. Some structures aren't meant to stand. Not if they're built on lies. The line went quiet except for the distant laughter of his children. In that moment, Alexander understood the terrible geometry of his life. He'd tried to love 2 families by dividing himself in half, only to discover that love doesn't fraction. It multiplies when shared honestly, and withers when hoarded in secret. Isabella stared out the town car window as the coastline blurred into streaks of blue and green. Elena's hand covered hers from the driver's seat, warm and steady. You don't have to talk, Elena said softly. But you're not going to a hotel. My guest house has fresh sheets and 0 memories of him. Isabella nodded, unable to speak. The tears had stopped flowing the moment she'd closed the penthouse door. Not from lack of pain, but from a sudden, crystalline clarity. Grief would come later. For now, survival demanded focus. When they arrived at Elena's Spanish-style home nestled in the hills, Isabella moved through the guest house like a ghost. She unpacked her single bag with methodical precision, toiletries arranged by size, clothes folded along familiar creases, the silver bracelet she never removed placed carefully on the nightstand. Each action was a ritual of reclamation. This space was hers. This moment was hers. This pain was hers to carry without apology. That evening, as Elena prepared tea in the kitchen, Isabella sat on the patio watching hummingbirds dart between bougainvillea blossoms. The simplicity of the scene, the unpretentious clay pots, the scent of jasmine, the absence of staff anticipating her needs, felt like oxygen after years in a gilded cage. You knew, Isabella said quietly when Elena joined her with 2 steaming mugs. Elena didn't pretend confusion. She simply nodded, wrapping her hands around her mug. Not the details, but I knew something was off. The way he'd cancel last minute on family events. The way you'd make excuses for him that even you didn't believe. She hesitated. I should have said something. No, Isabella said firmly. You respected my marriage. That's what friends do. She took a slow sip of chamomile tea, bitter, honest, real. But now I need you. Photograph of his hidden children staring up from the floor. And for the first time in his meticulously controlled life, he understood that some fractures cannot be repaired with money, with promises, or with love alone. Some truths, once uncovered, demand not forgiveness, but transformation. And as the front door clicked shut behind Isabella, he knew with still lying on the floor between them and the vast, indifferent ocean. For 10 seconds, he simply breathed, waiting for the sound of her key turning in the lock again, for the soft footsteps returning to explain this was just anger, just a momentary rupture that love could heal. But the silence deepened. He stumbled to the window, just in time to see her emerge from the private elevator onto the driveway below. She carried only a small leather overnight bag, no frantic packing, no dramatic exit with suitcases. Just a woman walking away from a decade of marriage with the quiet dignity of someone who had already left long before her body followed. "Isabella," he called, his voice cracking against the glass. She didn't turn, didn't pause, just slid into the back of a waiting town car. Elena's car, he realized with a fresh stab of pain, and disappeared down the winding coastal road. The penthouse, once a sanctuary of curated beauty, now felt like a museum of absence. He sank to his knees beside the fallen photograph, his fingers tracing the faces of Liam and Maya on the swing. Their joy mocked him. How many times had he promised to visit, how many school plays had he missed while negotiating deals that now felt meaningless? He'd built an empire to prove he was worthy of love, only to discover he'd been too afraid to live honestly within it. His phone buzzed on the desk, Clara's name flashing on the encrypted screen. He almost didn't answer, almost let the call go to voicemail where all his cowardice belonged. But a deeper instinct pulled him, the raw, unvarnished truth he'd avoided for 5 years. Alexander. Clara's voice was cautious. "You usually call after your board meeting." He couldn't speak at first. The words lodged in his throat like stones. "Alexander, are you all right?" I told her, he whispered, the confession tearing from him. "Isabella knows everything." A long silence stretched across the miles between them. He heard the faint sound of children's laughter in the background. Liam and Maya playing in their backyard, oblivious to the earthquake reshaping their father's world. "Oh, Alexander," Clara breathed, not with triumph or anger, but with a sorrow so profound it undid him completely. What did she say? She left. The words were ash in his mouth. She walked out and didn't look back. Another pause. Then, softly, "She has every right to." "You're not angry?" The question surprised even him. "Why would I be angry at her?" Clara's voice gentled. "I've spent 5 years watching you compartmentalize our children like inconvenient secrets." She just discovered she married a ghost. Her words landed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. He'd expected blame, recrimination, the messy drama of betrayed women. Instead, Clara offered clarity, the very thing he'd starved everyone of. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window. "I've spent my entire life building walls. I don't know how to tear them down without everything collapsing." "Then let it collapse," Clara said simply. "Some structures aren't meant to stand. Not if they're built on lies." The line went quiet except for the distant laughter of his children. In that moment, Alexander understood the terrible geometry of his life. He'd tried to love 2 families by dividing himself in half, only to discover that love doesn't fraction. It multiplies when shared honestly, and withers when hoarded in secret. Isabella stared out the town car window as the coastline blurred into streaks of blue and green. Elena's hand covered hers from the driver's seat, warm and steady. "You don't have to talk," Elena said softly. "But you're not going to a hotel. My guest house has fresh sheets and 0 memories of him." Isabella nodded, unable to speak. The tears had stopped flowing the moment she'd closed the penthouse door. Not from lack of pain, but from a sudden, crystalline clarity. Grief would come later. For now, survival demanded focus. When they arrived at Elena's Spanish-style home nestled in the hills, Isabella moved through the guest house like a ghost. She unpacked her single bag with methodical precision, toiletries arranged by size, clothes folded along familiar creases, the silver bracelet she never removed placed carefully on the nightstand. Each action was a ritual of reclamation. This space was hers. This moment was hers. This pain was hers to carry without apology. That evening, as Elena prepared tea in the kitchen, Isabella sat on the patio watching hummingbirds dart between bougainvillea blossoms. The simplicity of the scene, the unpretentious clay pots, the scent of jasmine, the absence of staff anticipating her needs, felt like oxygen after years in a gilded cage. "You knew," Isabella said quietly when Elena joined her with 2 steaming mugs. Elena didn't pretend confusion. She simply nodded, wrapping her hands around her mug. "Not the details. But I knew something was off. The way he'd cancel last minute on family events. The way you'd make excuses for him that even you didn't believe." She hesitated. "I should have said something." "No," Isabella said firmly. "You respected my marriage. That's what friends do." She took a slow sip of chamomile tea, bitter, honest, real. "But now I need you to respect my truth. Help me understand what I'm dealing with." Elena reached into her pocket and placed a tablet on the table between them. "I pulled some discreet records this afternoon while you were packing. Not illegally, just public filings you wouldn't normally see." Her fingers tapped the screen. Sterling Group has a shell corporation called Maple Holdings registered in Vermont. It owns a modest property on Elm Street in Burlington. Property taxes paid quarterly. School district records show 2 children enrolled at Oakwood Elementary, Liam and Maya Sterling. Isabella's breath caught. The names made real. The location made tangible. There's more, Elena continued gently. Clara Evans, she kept her maiden name, works as a children's librarian at the Burlington Public Library. No criminal record. No financial troubles beyond what Alexander's support covers. She's stable. Responsible. Not a gold digger or a schemer. The description should have brought relief. Instead, it carved a deeper wound. This wasn't a sordid affair with a manipulative mistress. It was a parallel family built on responsibility and quiet dignity. Everything her own marriage had pretended to be. Why didn't he just choose her? Isabella whispered, the question tearing from a place of raw vulnerability. If he loved her enough to have children, why marry me? Elena's eyes held hers with unwavering compassion. Maybe he didn't choose either of you. Maybe he chose the idea of having it all without consequences. And consequences, she added softly, always find you eventually. Night fell over the hills, stars emerging one by one in the violet sky. Isabella sat long after Elena had gone inside, the tablet glowing beside her with the evidence of her husband's double life. She thought of Liam's rocket drawing, Maya's missing front teeth, Clara's quiet strength-raising twins alone. She thought of Alexander on his knees in their study, his empire crumbling around him not from market forces, but from the weight of his own silence. And she understood with chilling clarity this wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. Not the dramatic, vengeful truth of tabloid scandals, but the quiet, transformative truth that rebuilds lives from the ground up. She wouldn't destroy Alexander, not out of mercy, but because destruction wouldn't heal the children caught in the crossfire. But she would no longer be the woman who accepted half measures and hidden lives. As the first stars of morning glimmered on the horizon, Isabella made her decision. She would not run from this pain. She would walk straight through it, toward a future where love didn't require secrets, where fatherhood wasn't measured in wire transfers, where a woman's worth wasn't tied to a man's ability to be honest. The path ahead was uncharted, terrifying, uncertain. But for the first time since finding that envelope beneath his desk, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: the fragile, terrifying stirrings of freedom. Somewhere across the city, Alexander sat alone in the dark penthouse, the outside the window, casting violet shadows across pages dense with clauses and signatures. Elena knelt beside her, a forensic accountant by training before she'd become a family law attorney. A skill set that had proven devastatingly useful in the past 72 hours. "Look here," Elena said softly, her finger tracing a line of text on a corporate filing. "Maple Holdings isn't just a shell company holding property. It's structured as a beneficiary trust with Sterling Group equity as collateral." She turned the tablet toward Isabella. Alexander didn't just set up monthly transfers. He pledged 15% of his controlling shares against this trust 5 years ago, right after the twins were born. Isabella's breath caught. She'd known about the money. But this was different. This was architecture. A deliberate, legally binding framework designed to protect Clara and the children even if Alexander's empire collapsed. Why would he do that? She whispered, her voice raw from 3 nights of fractured sleep. If he was so ashamed of them, why build such an elaborate safety net? Because shame and love aren't mutually exclusive, Elena replied gently. He was terrified of scandal, yes. But he also couldn't bear the thought of his children suffering if something happened to him. This trust activates automatically if he dies or becomes incapacitated, guaranteeing Clara full control of those shares until the twins turned 25. Isabella stared at the document until the words blurred. 15%. Enough to destabilize Sterling Group's board if suddenly controlled by an outsider. Enough to give Clara unprecedented leverage in Alexander's world. The very world he'd worked so hard to keep separate from his secret family. A soft chime broke the silence. Alexander's name flashing on her phone screen for the 7th time that morning. She'd let the previous 6 calls go to voicemail, each one a fresh wave of panic in his voice she could hear even through silence. This time, something shifted in her. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but a need to understand the man behind the architecture of lies. She answered on the 4th ring. Alexander. His exhale was ragged, relieved. Isabella. God, I've been. Where are you? She interrupted, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. At the penthouse. I haven't left. I I had the staff bring Liam's rocket drawing. It's on my desk now, next to Maya's picture. A pause thick with unshed tears. I should have done this years ago. Did you know, she began, choosing her words with surgical precision, that Maple Holdings holds 15% of your controlling shares, as collateral the silence on the other end was absolute. Not the silence of evasion she'd grown accustomed to, but the stunned quiet of a man realizing his secret scaffolding had been exposed. How did you? That's not important. She stood, pacing the small room as Elena watched with quiet intensity. What I need to understand is why you built such an elaborate legal structure to protect them while simultaneously hiding them from me. Which version of you is real? The father who pledged his empire to his children's future, or the husband who let his wife believe she was enough? Both, he whispered, the word cracking open like thin ice. Both are real. I love you, Isabella. I've never stopped. But loving you didn't erase my responsibility to them. And my fear of losing you made me a coward with them. His voice broke. I thought I could compartmentalize. Build walls between the parts of my life so no one would get hurt. I was wrong. I've hurt everyone. Tears streamed down Isabella's face, but she didn't wipe them away. Clara knows I know, she said softly. Did you tell her no? She called me yesterday. Said she'd seen a news segment about me canceling the London trip. Something I only did because I was hoping to talk to you. She put it together. Another ragged breath. She asked if you knew about the children. I couldn't lie to her anymore. So I told her the truth. And she said, his voice faltered, you should have told her years ago. She deserves better than secrets. Isabella sank onto the edge of the bed, the phone pressed tightly to her ear. Clara's words hung in the air between them. Not as a weapon, but as a mirror reflecting the same truth Isabella had been staring into for days. What happens now? Alexander asked, the question barely audible. I don't know, Isabella admitted, the honesty a fresh kind of pain. I can't unsee what I've seen. I can't unfeel the years of wondering why you flinched when I mentioned children. But I also can't ignore that those children exist, and they're innocent in all of this. She took a slow, deliberate breath. I need to meet them. The silence that followed was heavier than any ocean wave. Isabella, not as your wife, she clarified, her voice firming with resolve. Not as a threat, but as someone who needs to understand the full landscape of the life you built without me. I need to look Liam and Maya in the eyes and know they're real. Not photographs hidden behind other photographs. Not names on trust documents. Real children who call you daddy. Clara would never agree to that, he said, but without conviction. It would be too confusing for them. Then make her understand it's necessary, Isabella replied, a new strength entering her voice. Because here's what I've realized in these 3 days away from you, I don't want revenge. I don't want to destroy you or your company or even your relationship with Clara. But I refuse to be the woman who accepts half-truths for the rest of her life. If there's any possibility of rebuilding something honest between us, if there's any chance those children deserve a father who doesn't live in shadows, then we start with transparency. All of us. Together. She heard him swallow hard, the sound intimate even across miles of silence. I'll call Clara today. I'll explain. No, Isabella interrupted gently. Let me call her. You've controlled this narrative long enough. It's time the women in your life spoke directly to each other. She ended the call before he could protest, her heart hammering against her ribs. Elena watched her, eyes wide with concern. Isabella, are you sure meeting Clara? I'm not sure of anything, Isabella admitted, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. But I'm certain of this, those children deserve more than wire transfers and monthly visits. And I deserve more than a marriage built on omissions. She picked up her phone again, her fingers hovering over a new contact Elena had provided. Clara Evans, Burlington Public Library. If I'm going to decide what comes next, for me, for Alexander, for those children, I need to see the truth with my own eyes. Not through documents or photographs or his carefully curated explanations. She pressed call. 2 rings. 3. On the 4th, a soft, cautious voice answered. Clara Evans. Isabella closed her eyes, gathering every ounce of courage she possessed. Clara, this is Isabella Sterling, Alexander's wife. A pause, heavy with unspoken history. I'd like to meet you. And Liam and Maya. Not as rivals. Not as threats. But as 2 women who love the same flawed man. And who might, just might, want the same thing for his children. The silence on the other end stretched for 10 heartbeats. Then, softly, they have soccer practice Thursday at 4. Oakwood Elementary Field. Alexander usually comes, but He hasn't mentioned it this week. I'll be there, Isabella said, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest. Alone. No lawyers. No agendas. Just me. When she hung up, Elena reached for her hand. You're braver than I ever realized. Isabella looked toward the window, where hummingbirds darted between blossoms with fearless precision. I'm not brave, she corrected softly. I'm just tired of living in the shadow of a secret I didn't create. She turned to Elena, her eyes holding a new clarity. And I think, just maybe Clara is too. That evening, as sunset painted the hills in shades of rose and gold, Isabella sat at Elena's kitchen table, drafting a single email to Alexander. Not an ultimatum, not a declaration of war, but a boundary drawn in quiet strength. Alexander, I'm meeting Clara and the children Thursday after school. Not to confront you, not to make demands, but to see the truth with my own eyes. Whatever happens after that, whether we rebuild or part ways, will be decided with full knowledge. No more secrets. No more shadows. This ends in light, or it ends completely. She pressed send before she could second-guess herself. And as the email vanished into the digital ether, she felt the first genuine breath of freedom in 10 years. Not the freedom of escape, but the freedom of choosing to face truth head-on, however painful it might be. Somewhere across the city, Alexander would be reading those words. And for the first time since this fracture began, Isabella didn't wonder what he would do next. She only knew what she would do: walk toward the truth, hand extended not in surrender, but in the quiet hope that some broken things, when handled with honesty and care, might yet be remade into something stronger than before. The children deserved that chance. And so, hazel eyes, but her posture held a new architecture, shoulders squared not with defiance, but with quiet certainty. You don't have to do this alone, Elena said from the doorway, holding 2 mugs of tea. I could wait in the car. Or no. Isabella turned, offering a small, genuine smile. This is mine to walk through. But thank you for the safety net. She accepted the tea, the warmth seeping into her palms. I keep thinking about what you said, that consequences always find you eventually. I spent 10 years believing I was building a life with Alexander. But I was actually building a life around his secrets. There's a difference. Elena nodded slowly. And today you stopped building around them. The drive to Oakwood Elementary took 47 minutes, a stretch of highway winding through eucalyptus groves and sudden ocean vistas that Isabella had never seen before. She'd spent a decade in Alexander's world of private jets and chauffeured cars, never learning the geography of her own state. Today, she drove herself. The simple act of gripping the steering wheel, of choosing each turn without consultation, felt revolutionary. She arrived 20 minutes early, parking beneath a sprawling oak tree at the edge of the soccer field. Children's laughter carried on the breeze, high, unburdened sounds that made her chest ache. She watched parents unfold lawn chairs, hand out juice boxes, ruffle small heads of hair with effortless intimacy. The ordinary rituals of family life she'd been denied not by circumstance, but by deception. At 3:58 p.m., a familiar silver sedan pulled into the lot. Alexander's car. Her breath caught. But when the door opened, it wasn't Alexander who emerged. Clara stepped out first, slim, with dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a faded university sweatshirt. She moved with a quiet competence Isabella recognized instantly, the grace of a woman who had learned to carry weight alone. Then 2 small figures tumbled from the back seat. Liam in a blue jersey too big for his frame, Maya in pink cleats mismatched with her green shorts. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd studied their photograph until their faces were etched behind her eyelids. But seeing them in motion, Maya skipping toward the field, Liam carefully placing his water bottle at the edge of the grass, was different. They were real, breathing, laughing. Entire human beings Alexander had hidden from her like shameful artifacts. She should have waited in the car. Should have given Clara time to settle the children before approaching. But her feet moved without permission, carrying her across the dew-damp grass toward the woman who had borne her husband's children. Clara saw her first. Her steps faltered. For a long moment, the 2 women simply stared at each other across 20 yards of soccer field. The wife and the other mother, bound by a man's silence. Then Clara did something unexpected. She didn't glare or retreat. She simply nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that held neither hostility nor welcome. Just recognition. Isabella stopped 5 feet away, her hands clasped tightly before her. Thank you for agreeing to this. Clara's gaze flickered toward the field where Liam and Maya were joining their team. They don't know who you are, she said softly. And I'd like to keep it that way for now. Whatever happens between you and Alexander, these children have already lost enough. I'm not here to hurt them, Isabella said, the words raw with sincerity. I'm here to see them. To understand the truth I've been denied for 5 years. A whistle blew. The game began. Small bodies chased a bright yellow ball across emerald grass. Clara's attention split between the field and the woman beside her. This elegant stranger who moved through the world with a confidence Clara had long ago traded for survival. You loved him, Clara said after a long silence. Not a question, but an observation. Really loved him. I did, Isabella admitted, watching Maya trip over her own feet and scramble up laughing. I still do. That's what makes this so devastating. It's not that I stopped loving him. It's that I discovered I never really knew him. Clara's eyes glistened, but didn't spill over. I know that feeling. She gestured toward Liam, who'd just scored a goal and was scanning the sidelines. He's looking for Alexander. He always does. Even when he knows his father won't come. Her voice broke slightly. 5 years of canceled visits. 5 years of daddy's busy with important work. Do you know what that does to a child's understanding of love? Isabella felt the words like physical blows. I'm so sorry, she whispered, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. For all of you. For the children waiting for a father who chooses boardrooms over bedtime. For you raising them alone. For me living in a marriage built on omissions. She turned fully toward Clara, her vulnerability complete. I don't want to be your enemy. I never did. We've both been failed by the same man's cowardice. Clara studied her face, the genuine grief, the absence of performative anger, and something shifted in her expression. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the first crack in a wall built over years of isolation. He called me last night, Clara said quietly. Said you decided to meet us. He was terrified you'd hate them. A sad smile touched her lips. As if love for children could ever be conditional on their father's mistakes. Maya scored a goal then, a wobbly kick that sent the ball sailing past the goalie. She turned immediately toward the sidelines, her face alight with triumph, searching for a parent to witness her joy. Her eyes passed over Clara, then landed on Isabella. For 3 heartbeats, the little girl simply stared, curious, unafraid, recognizing something familiar in Isabella's features perhaps, some echo of the father they shared. Isabella's breath caught. She offered a small, tentative wave. Maya waved back, enthusiastic, unguarded, before turning back to the game, already forgetting the stranger on the sidelines. But Isabella would never forget that moment. The uncalculated kindness of a child who had no reason to trust her. The devastating purity of a love that asked for nothing but witness. When the final whistle blew, Clara gathered the children's gear with practiced efficiency. Liam approached first, sweaty and grinning, his glasses askew. Mom, can we get smoothies? He asked, then noticed Isabella. His smile faltered slightly. Who's that? Before Clara could answer, Isabella knelt to his level, careful not to invade his space. My name is Isabella, she said softly. I'm a friend of your father's. Liam studied her with the serious intensity of a child who had learned to read adult emotions. Are you sad? He asked suddenly. The question undid her completely. Sometimes, she admitted, her voice thick. But today I'm mostly grateful. For what? For meeting you. She met his gaze squarely. You built a rocket ship once. For your dad to fly to space. His eyes widened. How did you know? That she didn't answer. Just smiled. A real smile that reached her eyes for the first time in weeks. Liam considered her for another moment, then nodded solemnly, as if accepting her into his world. Maya scored 2 goals today, he announced proudly before running off to find his sister. Clara watched the exchange, her expression unreadable. When the children were out of earshot, she turned to Isabella. He hasn't mentioned that rocket drawing to anyone but Alexander in months. I know, Isabella said softly. I saw it on his desk last week. Alexander finally hung it up. A single tear traced a path down Clara's cheek. She didn't wipe it away. He's trying, she admitted. For the first time in 5 years, he's actually trying. As they walked toward the parking lot, the children chattering ahead of them, Isabella made her decision. Not with drama or declaration, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who had finally seen the full landscape of her life. She wouldn't return to the penthouse tonight. Or tomorrow. She would find her own apartment. Reconnect with the NBA network she'd abandoned after marriage. Build a life that belonged solely to her. But she would also ensure Liam and Maya never again wondered if their father loved them enough to show up. Not out of obligation to Alexander, but because those children, innocent casualties of adult failures, deserved to be witnessed in their joy and comforted in their sorrow by every adult who claimed to love them. At the car, Clara paused with the door open. Alexander called this morning. He's flying to Vermont tonight. For the weekend. No meetings. No excuses. She looked at Isabella, really looked at her. He said you gave him no choice but to be honest. Isabella nodded, her throat tight. Some people need the ground to fall away before they learn to stand on solid earth. Clara hesitated, then reached into her bag and withdrew a small photograph. The same one hidden behind the Tuscany picture in Alexander's study. She pressed it into Isabella's hand. Keep it, she said softly. Not as a weapon, but as a reminder that truth, however painful, is the only foundation worth building on. As Isabella drove away from the elementary school, the photograph resting on the passenger seat beside her, she understood with crystalline clarity that her marriage wasn't ending today. It had ended the moment Alexander chose secrecy over honesty. What began today was something new, not revenge, not reconciliation, but the slow, deliberate work of building a life anchored in truth. And as the coastal highway unwound before her, leading toward a horizon she would navigate alone for the first time in a decade, she felt not the weight of loss, but the terrifying, exhilarating lightness of freedom. The children deserved a father tea. She didn't head back to Elena's guest house. Instead, she followed an impulse she couldn't name, a pull toward the city she'd called home for a decade, but had never truly navigated alone. At a rest stop overlooking the Pacific, she parked and finally allowed herself to study the image properly Liam's determined chin. Maya's gap-toothed grin, the tire swaying gently behind them in a breeze captured forever. 5 years of birthdays, scraped knees, bedtime stories, all unfolding in a quiet Vermont backyard while she'd been planning charity galas and selecting wine pairings for dinner parties she now realized had been performances in a play where she didn't know her own lines. Her phone buzzed. A text from Elena. How did it go? Isabella typed slowly, her thumbs hovering over the screen. They're real. And beautiful. And they deserve better than secrets. She added a second message before sending I need my laptop. And my old MBA portfolio. The one from Stanford. The reply came instantly. Already packed it. Knew you'd need it eventually. Come home when you're ready. Home. The word felt foreign now. The penthouse wasn't home. Elena's guest house was sanctuary, not home. Home would have to be something she built from scratch, brick by emotional brick. 3 weeks later, Isabella sat in a sun-drenched conference room at Viridian Consulting, her fingers tracing the embossed logo on the contract before her. The managing partner, a sharp-eyed woman named Naomi Chun, who'd been Isabella's study group leader during their second year at Stanford, leaned forward, her expression unreadable. You understand this isn't charity, Isabella, Naomi said gently. I'm offering you a senior associate position because your thesis on cross-border asset structuring was groundbreaking. Because you aced every finance module while most of us were still grasping compound interest. And because she paused, choosing her words carefully. Because I watched you put your career on hold for a man who clearly didn't deserve that sacrifice. The business world lost a brilliant mind when you stepped away. I'd like to help you reclaim it. Isabella's throat tightened. She'd spent the past 21 days in a quiet frenzy of reclamation, updating her resume with skills she'd convinced herself were obsolete, reconnecting with classmates who remembered the fierce intellect beneath the billionaire's wife persona, practicing interview answers in Elena's guest bathroom mirror until her voice stopped trembling on the word divorce. I'm not the same woman who left Stanford, Isabella admitted, her gaze steady despite the tremor in her hands. I spent 10 years supporting someone else's ambitions. I'm terrified I've forgotten how to have my own. Naomi smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached her eyes. Ambition isn't like riding a bicycle. It's like breathing. You never actually forget. You just stop noticing you're doing it. She pushed the contract forward. This role focuses on corporate governance audits. Specifically, identifying structural vulnerabilities in family-owned enterprises transitioning to public markets. Your unique perspective on compartmentalized wealth structures could prove invaluable. The irony wasn't lost on Isabella. She'd be auditing companies for the very sins Alexander had committed. Hidden trusts, offshore transfers, emotional collateral disguised as financial prudence. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about transformation. About using the pain of betrayal to build something honest. I accept, she said, signing her name with a hand that no longer shook. The first month at Viridian was a baptism by fire. Isabella worked 12-hour days, relearning financial modeling software she'd once mastered in her sleep, attending client meetings where she was initially mistaken for an assistant despite her title. But slowly, the rust fell away. The woman who'd once negotiated merger terms over champagne flutes in Monaco boardrooms began to re-emerge. Not softer, not harder, but wiser. She asked questions others avoided. She spotted inconsistencies in trust structures that senior partners missed. And when a junior analyst presented findings on a luxury goods conglomerate with suspiciously opaque subsidiary holdings, Isabella's blood ran cold. Maple Holdings, she murmured, staring at the organizational chart projected on the conference room screen. Registered in Vermont. Shell Corporation holding 15% equity collateral. The analyst blinked. You know this entity? Isabella's pulse hammered in her throat. She'd recognized Alexander's architecture instantly. The same legal scaffolding he'd built to protect Liam and Maya now appearing in a completely unrelated audit. A coincidence or something more? I studied similar structures during my MBA, she lied smoothly, her professional mask flawless. Run a deeper analysis on their beneficial ownership chain. I suspect there's a personal trust layered beneath the corporate veil. After the meeting, she retreated to her glass-walled office, the smallest at Viridian, but hers alone, and pulled up Sterling Group's public filings on her secondary monitor. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing dates, tracing fund flows, mapping the invisible threads connecting Alexander's empire to his secret family. And there it was, not one vulnerability, but a cascade. The 15% equity pledged to Maple Holdings wasn't just a safety net, it was a structural weakness. If triggered unexpectedly, it could destabilize Sterling Group's entire board composition. More dangerously, the trust documents contained a clause Alexander had clearly overlooked in his haste to protect his children's automatic equity released to Clara upon marital dissolution involving primary beneficiary. Divorce. The word landed like a verdict. She sat back, her breath shallow. Alexander hadn't just hidden his family, he'd built a financial time bomb into the foundation of his empire. One that would detonate the moment their marriage legally ended, transferring unprecedented power to Clara without Alexander's consent. He'd been so focused on protecting his children from scandal that he'd failed to protect his company from the very consequences he feared. Her phone buzzed. A text from Clara. Liam asked about you again. Said you had kind eyes. We're having pancakes Saturday morning if you'd like to join. No pressure. Just they like you. Isabella stared at the message, then at the damning financial analysis glowing on her screen. Two paths diverged before her, one leading toward vengeance, exposing Alexander's structural weakness to the board, watching his empire crumble as poetic justice for his deception. The other leading toward something harder, riskier, more human, using her newfound knowledge not as a weapon, but as leverage to force transparency. To ensure Liam and Maya's future wasn't held hostage by their father's fear. To build a new framework where love didn't require secrecy to survive. She typed her reply to Clara with deliberate care. I'd love pancakes. 9 a.m. and Clara. Thank you for seeing me as more than his wife. Then she opened a new document and began drafting an email. Not to Alexander's board, not to his lawyers, but to Alexander himself. Subject line: we need to talk about Maple Holdings. Her fingers hovered over the keys. This wasn't about destroying him. It was about saving what could still be saved. Not their marriage necessarily, but the possibility of an honest future for everyone entangled in his web of secrets, including the children who deserved fathers and mothers who showed up without shadows. As sunset painted her office in shades of rose and gold, Isabella Sterling made her choice. She would walk into the fire of truth not with weapons, but with blueprints for rebuilding. And when Alexander read her email tomorrow morning, he would finally understand that the woman he'd underestimated, the woman he'd hidden his truth from, had become the only person capable of helping him build a life where love didn't require lies to survive. The real question wasn't whether he would acquire that blurred into meaningless shapes. The European acquisition he'd staked his reputation on was unraveling. Not because of market forces, but because he'd approved 3 critical contracts without his usual due diligence. Signing documents while replaying the sound of Isabella's voice, saying you picked it up and hid it again. That was your last chance. Alexander, his CFO, stood in the doorway, face etched with concern. The board is asking questions about the liquidity projections. They say your revisions don't align with Q3 realities. Alexander didn't look up. Tell them I'll present corrected figures tomorrow. But the vote is tomorrow morning. Without solid numbers, I said tomorrow, he snapped, the words sharper than intended. He watched his CFO retreat, shoulders stiff with wounded pride. Another fracture. Another consequence of his unraveling focus. His encrypted phone buzzed, Clara's name flashing on the screen. He answered on the first ring, desperate for an anchor in the storm. Alexander. Her voice was calm, but carried an unfamiliar edge. The children asked why you missed Liam's dentist appointment yesterday. Again, I had a board emergency. There are no emergencies that last 3 consecutive appointments, she interrupted gently but firmly. Maya drew you another picture. She stopped giving them to me to deliver. Says it's pointless if you never see them anyway. The words landed like stones in his chest. He stared out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city he'd conquered. The glass towers, the glittering bay, the empire built on a foundation of sand. I'll be there this weekend, he promised, the same hollow vow he'd made a dozen times before. I'll cancel everything. No. The single word hung between them, heavy with finality. Don't cancel for us. Show up because you want to. Or don't show up at all. But stop promising what you can't deliver. The children are learning that adults lie to make themselves feel better. I won't let you teach them that lesson anymore. Clara, please. I've spoken to a family mediator, she continued, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. Not a lawyer. A mediator. Because I believe these children deserve a father who participates in their lives consistently. Not when his schedule permits, but because they matter more than board meetings. She paused, and when she spoke again, her words were measured with heartbreaking precision. I'm not asking you to choose between Isabella and us. I'm asking you to choose honesty over convenience. For once in your life. The line went dead. Alexander lowered the phone, his reflection staring back from the black screen. A man in a $1,000 suit surrounded by symbols of success, utterly bankrupt in the currency that mattered most, presence. His assistant's voice filtered through the intercom. Mr. Sterling, Ms. Sterling is here to see you. She didn't have an appointment, but Alexander's breath caught. Isabella. Here. Now. Send her in, he said, his voice rough with emotion. When the door opened, she stood framed in the doorway. Not the woman who'd left him 3 weeks ago in a haze of heartbreak, but someone new. Her posture carried a quiet authority. Her eyes held no anger, only a profound, unsettling clarity. She wore a simple navy-sheath dress and carried a leather portfolio. Not a weapon, but a tool. You look tired, she said softly, closing the door behind her. He almost laughed, a broken, ragged sound. I haven't slept since you left. I know. She crossed the room and placed the portfolio on his desk. Not between them as a barrier, but beside his keyboard as an offering. I've been auditing Sterling Group's subsidiary structures for Viridian Consulting. The blood drained from his face. You're working against me, no. She met his gaze squarely. I'm working for the truth. And the truth is this Maple Holdings contains a clause you overlooked. Upon marital dissolution, 15% equity automatically transfers to Clara. Not as a trust beneficiary, but as direct shareholder. She opened the portfolio, revealing crisp financial analyses. You built a safety net for your children that could destabilize your entire empire the moment we filed divorce papers. Alexander sank into his chair, the world tilting beneath him. He'd been so focused on hiding his family that he'd failed to protect them from the very consequences he feared. I didn't know, he whispered. The lawyers drafted those documents years ago. I never read the fine print. Of course you didn't, Isabella said, not with accusation, but with sorrowful understanding. You were too busy building walls to notice the cracks in the foundation. She tapped a specific clause highlighted in yellow. This isn't just a financial vulnerability. It's a moral one. You've structured your children's security around the assumption that your marriage would never end, that I would never discover the truth. You made their future contingent on my ignorance. Tears welled in his eyes, hot, shameful, overdue. I was afraid, he admitted, the words tearing from a place he'd kept locked for years. Afraid of scandal. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of being the man who couldn't have it all. He looked up, his gaze raw and unguarded. But mostly I was afraid of facing myself. The man who chose boardrooms over bedtime stories, who measured love in wire transfers instead of presence. Isabella didn't reach for him. Didn't offer empty comfort. She simply stood there, bearing witness to his unraveling with a compassion that hurt more than anger ever could. Clara called me this morning, she said softly. She's not interested in your shares. She's interested in your presence. She wants you at school events, at dentist appointments, at bedtime. Not as a financial provider, but as a father. Isabella's voice broke slightly. And I want to understand if there's a version of you that can exist without secrets. Not for me, not for our marriage, but for those children who deserve a father who shows up without shadows. Alexander stared at the financial documents, the cold, hard truth of his failures laid bare in spreadsheets and legal clauses. Then he looked at Isabella, this woman who had every right to destroy him, but had instead brought him a blueprint for redemption. What do I do? He whispered, the question of a man who had spent a lifetime commanding boardrooms, but had no map for navigating his own heart. Isabella finally moved closer, placing her hand over his on the desk. Her touch was warm, steady, real. You start by canceling your weekend in London. You fly to Vermont tomorrow. You attend Liam's dentist appointment. You stay for pancakes afterward. And when Maya asks why you're there, you tell her the truth, because I love you, and I'm learning how to be better. She withdrew her hand, leaving the warmth lingering on his skin like a promise. I'm not saying we'll reconcile. I'm not saying I can ever fully trust you again. But I am saying this: those children deserve parents who choose honesty over convenience. And if you're willing to do the terrifying work of living in the light, without compartments, without secrets, without hiding, I'll help you build that life. Not as your wife. Not yet. But as a partner in truth. Alexander looked from the damning financial documents to Isabella's steady gaze, and for the first time in 5 years of living a double life, he felt the crushing weight of his secrets begin to lift. Not because they'd vanished, but because he was finally ready to carry them in the light where they could be examined, understood, and perhaps transformed. I'll call Clara tonight, he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. I'll tell her I'm coming tomorrow. No excuses. No corporate emergencies. He met Isabella's eyes, really met them, for the first time since she'd walked into his office. And I'll tell her you're coming too. Isabella's breath caught. Alexander, not as my wife, he clarified quickly, reading her hesitation. As the woman who helped me see that love without honesty is just another kind of loneliness. He stood, his movements deliberate, purposeful. We'll sit at that Formica kitchen table in Vermont. We'll drink terrible coffee from mismatched mugs. And we'll build a new framework for these children. One where they never have to wonder if their father's love comes with conditions. Outside the window, the city glittered, indifferent to the quiet revolution unfolding in a corner office 60 floors above the streets. Alexander Sterling, billionaire titan, stood before the woman he'd betrayed, not with grand gestures or promises of redemption, but with the simplest, most terrifying offer of all: the truth. And as Isabella looked at him, really looked, she saw not the liar who had fractured their world, but the broken man finally willing to rebuild it, brick by honest brick. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. Trust wouldn't be restored overnight. But for the first time since discovering his secret family, Isabella felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, not hope exactly, but the fragile, trembling possibility of it. And sometimes, with flowers for Clara and 2 small gifts wrapped in comic book pages, Liam's favorite superheroes. No corporate armor. No evasions. Just a man sitting at a Formica table, buttering pancakes with trembling hands while Maya chattered about her loose tooth and Liam demonstrated how his new glasses helped him see the scoreboard. You came, Maya had said simply when Alexander arrived, her small hand patting the empty chair beside her. Not with accusation, but with the quiet wonder of a child who'd stopped expecting miracles. And when Alexander's phone buzzed during breakfast, the board chair demanding an emergency call about the European acquisition, he'd silenced it without apology. Daddy's busy right now, he'd told Liam, who'd stared at him with wide eyes. With us. The moment had nearly undone Isabella. Not because it was perfect, it wasn't. Alexander fumbled with syrup bottles. He mispronounced Maya's teacher's name. He kept glancing at Isabella as if seeking permission to exist in this space. But he stayed. For 3 hours he stayed. Now, back in her new apartment, a sunlit 1-bedroom with second-hand furniture and walls still bare, Isabella sat cross-legged on the floor surrounded by financial statements. Elena and Naomi Chin flanked her, their presence a quiet anchor in the storm of her next decision. You don't have to do this, Elena said gently, tracing a finger over Sterling Group's shareholder registry. What happened in Vermont changes things. He's trying. He's trying today, Isabella corrected softly, her gaze fixed on the spreadsheet glowing on her laptop. But trying isn't structural change. Alexander built an empire on compartmentalization. One honest weekend doesn't rewire a decade of behavior. She turned to Naomi. You said Viridian has connections to the Halcyon Impact Fund. Naomi nodded slowly. They specialize in ethical shareholder activism, acquiring minority stakes to influence corporate governance without hostile takeovers. But Isabella, this is your husband's company. There are personal entanglements, which is precisely why I need Halcyon, Isabella interrupted, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I won't use this as a weapon. I'll use it as a safeguard. She pulled up a new document, her own analysis of Sterling Group's vulnerabilities. Maple Holdings isn't the only weakness. Alexander's board is stacked with yes-men who've enabled his compartmentalization for years. If he has a genuine change of heart, he'll welcome oversight. If not, she met Naomi's gaze squarely. The children deserve protection from his patterns, not just his promises. Elena reached for her hand. What if he discovers it's you behind the acquisitions? Then he'll have to confront the consequence of his choices, Isabella said, the words tasting like truth rather than threat. Not punishment. Accountability. There's a difference. 3 weeks later, Alexander stood before his board of directors, sweat beading at his temples despite the climate-controlled conference room. The quarterly report lay open before him, but his attention was fixed on a single-line item that had appeared mysteriously in the shareholder registry Halcyon Impact Fund. 4.7% equity. Since when do we have activist investors? The CFO demanded, stabbing a finger at the document. They've been quietly accumulating shares for 6 weeks. No public filings. No disclosure. Alexander's blood ran cold. Halcyon. He knew their reputation, ethical but relentless. They'd dismantled 3 family empires in the past year, not through hostile takeovers, but by exposing governance failures that public markets punished mercilessly. I'll handle it, he said, his voice tighter than intended. After the meeting, he retreated to his office and dialed Isabella. She answered on the second ring. Isabella, Halcyon is buying into Sterling Group. Do you know anything about— I know they specialize in corporate transparency, she interrupted, her tone carefully neutral. Interesting choice for a company with such compartmentalized subsidiary structures. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken understanding. Is this you? He asked finally, the words barely audible. I'm a senior associate at Viridian Consulting, she replied. My job is to identify governance vulnerabilities. What others choose to do with that information isn't my decision. A pause. But if I were you, Alexander, I'd prepare for their questions about Maple Holdings. And the 15% equity clause triggered by marital dissolution. He sank into his chair, the world tilting beneath him. She wasn't attacking him. She was holding up a mirror, and the reflection showed a man whose empire rested on foundations of sand. Why, he whispered. After Vermont, after everything. Why would you do this? Because love without accountability is just another form of abandonment, she said, her voice softening. I'm not trying to destroy you. I'm trying to build guardrails so you can't destroy yourself, or those children, through the same patterns that broke us. Her breath caught slightly. Halcyon doesn't want to dismantle Sterling Group. They want to restructure its governance to prioritize long-term stability over short-term ego. And they'll need a board ally to succeed. You want me to partner with them? He asked, stunned. I want you to choose, she clarified. Partner with Halcyon voluntarily and reshape your company's DNA to value transparency. Or wait for them to force changes that will humiliate you. Publicly. The choice reveals who you're becoming, the man who hides in shadows or the man who builds in light. That evening, Alexander sat alone in his Langham suite, the city glittering beyond the glass like scattered diamonds. His phone buzzed. A text from Clara Liam asked if he'll come to the school play next week. I told him to ask you himself. He typed his reply with deliberate care. Tell him I'll be there. Front row. And I'll bring Isabella too, if she'll come. Clara's response came quickly. She already said yes. The children like her. Alexander stared at the words until they blurred. Isabella was building a new life without him, yet still showing up for his children. Not out of obligation. Not out of lingering love for him, but because she believed those small humans deserved witnesses to their joy. His encrypted phone buzzed again. Halcyon's managing director requesting a discreet meeting. Alexander almost declined, almost retreated into the familiar fortress of control that had defined his life for 45 years. But then he thought of Maya's hand patting the empty chair beside her. You came. He typed his reply tomorrow. 10 a.m. My office. As he set the phone down, he understood with chilling clarity that Isabella hadn't orchestrated this takeover to punish him. She'd engineered it to give him a choice he'd never allowed himself before, to lead with integrity or be forced into it. And in that choice lay the possibility of becoming the father, and perhaps one day the partner, those children deserved. The real suspense wasn't whether Halcyon would succeed. It was whether Alexander Sterling, architect of empires, had the courage to dismantle the walls he'd built around his own heart. And whether the woman who'd walked away from her eyes crinkling with joy he'd mistaken for permanence. And there, tucked behind the others, a photograph he'd carried in his wallet for years but never displayed, Isabella at 28, standing before a Stanford lecture hall, chalk dust on her fingers, eyes alight with a fire he'd quietly extinguished when he'd asked her to focus on us after their wedding. His thumb traced the curve of her smile in that Stanford photo, the woman she'd been before she became Mrs. Sterling, before she'd traded boardrooms for charity galas, before she'd learned to measure her worth in his reflected light. He'd loved her fiercely, yes, but he'd loved the version of himself she reflected back more. The successful husband, the provider, the man who could give her everything except the one thing that mattered, his whole truth. A soft chime broke the silence. Clara's text from hours earlier still glowing on his screen. She already said yes. The children like her. Isabella, coming to Liam's school play. Not as his wife. Not as a threat. But as a witness. As someone who saw those children not as complications to be managed, but as humans deserving of love without conditions. He picked up his phone, fingers hovering over her contact. Not to apologize again. That had become its own form of manipulation. Not to plead, but to say the thing he'd been too afraid to voice even to himself. Isabella, I looked at our photos tonight. The ones from before we built walls between us. I miss the man I was when I was fully known by you. Not the billionaire. Not the provider. Just Alexander. I don't know if he still exists. But I want to find him. For the children. For you. For me. He stared at the words for 10 minutes, thumb resting on send. This wasn't strategy. This was surrender, not to her, but to the truth that had been waiting in the silence. All along he'd spent a decade building an empire to prove he was worthy of love, only to discover that love had been offered freely all along. He'd just been too terrified to receive it without armor. He pressed send. The reply came faster than he expected. I miss him too. The man who recited Neruda in bookstores. Who held my hand through my father's funeral without saying a word. He's still in there. But he has to choose to come out. No more hiding. Tears welled, not the performative tears of guilt he'd shed in their penthouse study, but something deeper, quieter. The tears of a man finally meeting himself after years of avoidance. He thought of Liam's rocket drawing now hanging on his office wall, of Maya's missing front tooth, of Clara's quiet strength raising twins alone while he'd been too afraid to be fully present in either world. He'd believed compartmentalization was protection, but it was just slow-motion abandonment, of his children, of Isabella, of himself. His encrypted phone buzzed, a reminder for the 10 a.m. Halcyon meeting. The board would expect him to fight them, to deploy every legal weapon in his arsenal to preserve his control, to protect the empire he'd built on foundations of sand. But as dawn painted the skyline in shades of rose and gold, Alexander understood with crystalline clarity empires built on secrets don't collapse from outside forces. They crumble from within, grain by grain, until one day there's nothing left but dust and regret. He'd spent 5 years terrified that revealing his secret family would destroy everything. But the truth was, the secrecy itself had already destroyed it. The trust, the intimacy, the possibility of a love that didn't require shadows to survive. He opened his laptop and typed a single email to his executive assistant: cancel all meetings today except Halcyon at 10 a.m. and reschedule the London trip indefinitely. Family takes precedence. The words felt foreign on his screen. Family without qualification, without